stairs, but yeah, we don't. We like
Giù, vita della tua prestanza.
Oh, yes. Works too well. Good morning still, ladies and gentlemen, and dear colleagues, to this new panel organized by the colleagues from the Commission's department in charge of energy policy, which is meant to discuss about planning and building environmentally sound projects. This sounds very nice, also sounds a little bit complicated, and I think one of the main missions of our discussions this morning, and I will give the floor immediately to the different panelists, but maybe we have a few moments also to hear from you questions and comments. One of the main objectives of this panel is to try to demystify a little bit this complexity and the mythology of complexity which has been created around the planning procedures and in particular around the environmental authorizations. And I think we should aim, or at least I will aim, I'm coming from the Commission's department in charge of environmental policy, to explain why this complexity is not as difficult as it appears and why it serves, and the environmental procedure serves the wider public good at a time, in particular when our communities, our societies take an ever-growing interest in the environmental aspects and in the implications of the different industrial and energy projects and all kind of projects, take an interest in the impact of these projects on their lives, on the lives of their communities, and on the life of the environment surrounding these communities and the people. So by complying with environmental regulations, we are in fact translating the interest and the value of the different energy projects, in this case, in the language of our communities, and associating the public in the decision-making, consulting the public where there is necessary. In fact, the economic operators and the public authorities smoothen the societal acceptance of these projects. So my name is Aurel Ciobanu Dordea. I'm Director in DG Environment in, as I mentioned, the Commission's department in charge of environmental policy, and I have the pleasure to moderate this panel today, which includes a few distinguished participants. First of all, in the middle, Antonella Battalini, Chief Executive Officer of the Renewable Grid Initiative. Thomas Wagner, Public Project Advisor from TenneT TSO GmbH in Germany. Ariel Brunner, Head of EU Policy, the BirdLife Europe Foundation, or is it association? Yeah, it's an NGO. And Adel Motawi, Head of Authorization and Consultation Department, Terna. So thanks a lot for having accepted the invitation to participate as well, and I hope we will have a useful and also relaxed exchanges about our practical experiences, your practical experiences in particular, and the lessons you can draw from your experience about how different procedures can be smoothened out and how they can be simplified and be run in a way which is both friendly to the economic operators or to the public authorities which promote these projects, but also to the public and to the environment. And of course, I don't expect you to share with us only the ideal experiences and the positive experiences, but where it's relevant and you have arguments, I would welcome also critical comments from your side. So let's try to learn from both the positive lessons and the less positive lessons. Occasionally, as I have myself a certain policy interest in the topic which is on the agenda today, I might intervene or make myself a number of comments. But first of all, I was wondering which one of you would like to intervene first and to comment around the topic. Antonella?
I start, otherwise Ariel starts. So let me briefly say what RGI is, because many of you know, you have seen the show yesterday, but it is a strange animal in town. That's the way I call it, because it is an association of transmission system operators, so the TSOs, and NGOs, many of them environmental NGOs. These two groups used to be enemy, because building infrastructure does create impacts on the environment and on people. But under the RGI umbrella, they have learned to trust each other and to challenge each other. My position is that it doesn't matter how good you are, you can always be better. And this is what we push in the RGI contest, all our members to be better. And now I come to legislation. One of the big pieces of work that we have done has been discussing, do we need environmental legislation? You know very well that there is a strong push by certain actors to say, oh, we need infrastructure and therefore we need to relax environmental legislation. We need to build relax environmental legislation. Well, our experience, both from the TSOs and the NGO side, is that actually that's not true. If you want to build fast, you need very clear rules, because clarity delivers the ability to develop projects within the rule of laws. If you don't have rules, you don't know what are you going to face. So the risks of uncertainties are very high, and these have a repercussion also on the investment risks. So I really appreciate the work that the Commission does in defining legislation, but I also would like to see the Commission much more active in pushing national government, national authorities and bodies to be more efficient, to be more responsible and more progressive. We need monitoring, measuring, reporting on how things are being done, because project developers need a reference point. We need to create the lowest benchmark, and we need to push for doing better. Can I pass the microphone to Ariel? I'm sure he wants to add on this.
Yes, but I would like to provide a short feedback to already what you've said, and I would say we are fully aware in the Commission of this, and I would say that also environmental authorities in the Member States are fully aware of this need, and first of all of the need for securing a level playing field. And here I would draw everyone's attention the fact that not the European Union has invented the environmental impact assessments. These were creations of national regulators, but there were differences between them, and this is why in 1985 there was the first ever legislation at the EU level at that time, adopted in the area of environmental impact assessments in order to secure a certain level playing field for economic operators, for instance, active in more than one member states. And the second comment would be to draw your attention to the fact that Yeah, we are the regulators and the public authorities in this area. We are in a sort of partnership between the European level and the national level. And in 2014, the environmental impact assessment legislation was adopted, in particular in order to follow the simplification path which was adopted by the 10E regulation adopted in 2013. So we have revised the environmental impact assessment directive, and this has become applicable since 2017 in all member states, in order to provide the possibility to give freedom, to give mandate to the national authorities to simplify and to integrate the various environmental assessments which are required by the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive, by the Water Framework Directive, by the Habitats Directive, by the Industrial Emissions Directive. Depending on the nature of the projects, one or several such obligations apply. So there is full power now for the national legislators and regulators to operate this simplification and integration of the permitting procedures and to make them simpler, more streamlined. And we also know a little bit about the experience at national level. We noted different features. For instance, we noted the practice of a limited number of member states, but however not a negligible number, which have historically, building on a historic tradition in terms of building permits and authorizations, they have created parallel tracks for the building permits and for the environmental permits. And these member states struggle because they prefer to keep this twin track instead of integrating them and taking a holistic view at the authorization of projects. But I would stop here. So, yeah.
So maybe just I think what we really need now, we have a real good base. The nature directives, it's an excellent starting point. But we need to create the conditions for experimenting new approaches, an incentive to do more, and of course we need also to fill those gaps that obviously are there and they require urgent attention, like in the marine environment.
Yeah, I fully agree with pretty much everything that Antonella said. And RGI, I think, is a very kind of exciting experiment, which is based on a couple of more things. One of them is agreeing on the kind of strategic objectives and end results and values. So if we agree about climate action and biodiversity conservation, then we can have, a civilized discussion about it. When we face people who negate the problem, it becomes a lot more difficult. So that's one pillar of it, is just admitting the science, admitting the problems, and agreeing on what we want to achieve. The second thing is taking legislation seriously. So seeing legislation not as something that stands in the way of your business, but as a fundamental piece of your doing business. If you get those things right, then the rest is details in a sense, and the details can be complicated, but we've seen with these sectors, with other sectors, that progress is possible. I would throw on the table a few things. One is the issue of the level play field and the need for strong enforcement, and that's your side of the house. We know that we have around Europe good companies, bad companies, better public authorities, misbehaving public authorities. It's very uneven. And every time we let someone play with the rules, we harm everyone. We harm the honest companies that are playing by the book. We are harming the credibility of the institutions, and we are harming also the companies that play well, because when it comes to public perception, most people do not distinguish this company from that company, this sector from that sector, the wind farm from the electricity line. If an energy company misbehaves, it gives a bad image to everyone. So first of all is getting the rules applied across the board. The second thing is really making sure that member states put in place the basic infrastructure that we need, the legal and the conceptual infrastructure, that the Natura sites are designated, that they have management plans, that we have conservation objectives defined, all of those things, so that then the company knows, you know, what is the job to be done. The third thing is, and Antonella was alluding to it, is transparency. We have all of this issue hangs on environmental data. Most of it is at the moment proprietary, it's hidden, it's not being published. You have people doing an impact assessment and then putting it in a drawer, and then someone else comes and does the same assessment of something very similar in the same place. It's a huge waste of resources for everybody involved. So we need to start creating a system in which all of this data and the assessments and the results of failed assessments and so on are all out there in the public domain, available to everyone, so that we don't reinvent the wheel again and again.
And I will shut up, but all these studies in the grid business, they are paid by the grid tariffs. And as such, they are actually owned by the public because they've been paid. So it's important to create the condition for sharing data of scientific studies that are paid by tariffs, just to make it clear.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for your comments, and if I were to react, and thanks a lot to Aurel as well for the wealth of structured comments he has made. Some would say, well, but we are here in a meeting of the, I don't know which is a constituency here, but I imagine it's energy authorities from the member states, economic operators in the sector of energy, so you are telling us about a lot of environmental obligations which are more to the task of the environmental authorities. We, the energy people, don't deal with the designation of the special areas of conservation or things like this. This is a responsibility of the environmental authorities. But there are nevertheless lessons to be drawn from what you've said for the economic operators. And I would get back to your remark on the level playing field. And I would give an example which is relevant for a few practical experiences which are currently unfolding, because we have a member state which has a project which is funded by this PCI component, by this funding facility for projects of common interest, and which is struggling with an environmental issue. And in fact, that member state, which I will not name, is struggling more with an obligation in the environmental legislation, in the Habitats Directive. There must be a notification made to the European Commission, and possibly they have to ask also for the opinion of the Commission. Now, if you look at the practice of the Commission, which is publicly available on the website, you will see that there are about 30 opinions already adopted by the European Commission. There are economic operators from member states like Germany, France, Spain, which have asked for these opinions, and they got the derogations. So we are not confronted now with a new thing which we don't know to handle. But I would say the second thing. I would make the second remark, and maybe it's a little bit brutal. Listen, the economic operators from Germany, France, or Spain, or whichever member state has applied for derogation are not stupid to comply with the rules, and other smart people can bypass the rules and find shortcuts. This is the idea of the level playing field, that on the single market, including in the sector of energy, everyone must play according to the same rule book. It's a matter of rule of law. So trying to bypass the obligations, even if they appear as procedural obligations, they secure this, they are the guardian of this level playing field. So they have an economic importance. It's not just a paper process. So you make your life more difficult, not more easy, by trying to find shortcuts. So embrace the obligations in their entirety and plan for meeting them, because the costs are not excessive. And I would make a second comment based on what Antonella has mentioned, and I would refer to practical lessons which we have drawn from ourselves, from our work together with the colleagues from the Energy Department of the European Commission in the assessment of projects of common interest. We have noted that in certain cases, projects proposed come at a very early stage, just to grab the money, but they are not fully thought through. We see that sometimes the economic implications, the construction implications, sometimes the environmental implications are not entirely thought through. So it is much easier from experience, from the viewpoint of the practical experience, it is much easier to come up with proposals which are well thought through and which have a certain analysis, are based on these studies, and the public authorities know very well what permits, when they can be delivered. They comply also with public procurement rules. Sometimes these are applicable as well, with competition rules if state aid is involved. So embrace the obligations, take a holistic view, and take an informed view about these obligations and what you have to do. And this will only help your process, your decision-making process at domestic level, and will help the processing of the project also at European level in order to get the funding that you need. Otherwise, nobody is challenging the importance of energy projects, and the projects of common interest are maybe even more important than others because they really connect the grids between the member states and work even more obviously for the single market on energy. And we are all supportive and willing to make this work and to disburse the funds in order to change the reality to the well. But we must all work together hand in hand for this purpose. So, Adel?
Yes. Just another idea. I appreciate a lot about possibility to have a consultation for PCI's project. We know there is a regulation, a European regulation that regulates these measures, and it's very important to build the project with territories, speaking with local authorities, of course, but speaking with stakeholders, with citizens, and create a connection between the strategic environmental assessment level with the environmental impact assessment level. It is important that who works in environmental impact assessment recognize and accept the work we did before with local authorities and citizens. But this approach is only for PCI's project, and we need to extend this approach to the other projects, because it's very important to build projects with territories. So this will help for the process from the idea of the project to the construction of the project.
Building on the experience with these PCI projects, to generalize this experience,
yes, we have to extend
in other areas. I mean, for, let's say, common ordinary energy projects. I think this is also in the hands of the member states. And I think it's interesting. I guess the colleagues from DG Energy have other panels where member states also can speak, and it's important to hear from them. But I think maybe after Thomas intervenes as well, we can give the floor also to the audience and to hear what colleagues have to say. Thomas.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to the importance of transparency and level the playing field with the stakeholders that are involved in the PCI projects. I myself, I work for the project Südlink. It's a high voltage grid in Germany. We want to transport renewable energy from the north to the south. So we have a lot of support from environmental NGOs that see the need of this grid. But all of this changes when you go down to a local level, because then you have a real impact with this project. And what I think is really interesting to get into these conflicts of interests, because we as a grid operator have an interest, the environmental community has interests, so does the public sector and the municipalities that are involved. And what we are trying to do is to make these conflicts transparent. We invented a web-based geoinformation system where we put in all the data that we and our the people we hire for the planning procedure. All the data that is received comes in this public geoinformation system that everybody can open, and then get at least the first impact on how on what conflicts are there, and then how we as the TSO try to deal with these conflicts. And I think this is an important step, because when you make the information available to everybody, I think understanding for each side grows. But what also happens, and that's what I personally think is very interesting, when I started to work for projects in the energy sector, it was always the technicians that said, we got to go this way. Nowadays, my experience is, at least with TenneT, that environmental planning says where we have to go. But what I also see is, if I may have a thesis on this, that in a couple of years, it'll be more and more driven by the general public and their opinion on the project. Because what I see now is when we are planning, we have to deal with a lot of environmental regulations and legal obligations and that we have to fulfill, and that are not negotiable. But the public sometimes wants something totally different, and they express their wishes loud, and they know how to articulate them in the public sectors, in the political sector. So I think there's the next shift in planning, going away from environmental issues more to public acceptance issues.
I can only react in the same direction as your comments, in particular as we are dealing in DG Environment more with environmental regulation than anything else. We see how communities react via the complaints that we receive, which of course are not necessarily the 100% correct or accurate diagnostic of the state of the public opinion, but you see immediately when there are sensitive topics how the input that the Commission receives about what is going on the ground. You see from this input how certain projects and certain topics reverberate in the public opinion. And sometimes this public opinion pressure puts the Commission under pressure as well. Antonella.
I think that we need to be very careful, because what is happening is that we are creating polarization. So it is infrastructure against environment, environment against people. And this doesn't mean that we need to continue, or we can continue to do the things as we have done in the past, but rather to bundle the needs together and see how, for example, energy infrastructure can become a service for the environment and can become an opportunity for local development. And I would like to now mention something that Terna is doing that I think it's fantastic. They are equipping, and maybe Adel can tell better than me, they are equipping pylons with sensors to prevent forest fires. And actually, when you think out of the box, you can do so much more than just transmit electricity. You can create green corridors, you can create new ecosystems, and this is what we need to work on, and we need a legislation in place that allows us to do it. We need a regulatory setting that incentivizes doing this, because otherwise we will always have a community against the other, and we will never manage to do this. Maybe.
Can you be more specific about, I mean, because it's for the second time that you are mentioning that we need a regulatory framework that authorizes and incentivizes. I mean, what is exactly, according to you, is missing?
Well, of course, I'm talking about the broad regulatory framework. It's not only the environmental legislation, but also the energy regulators that define what it is possible, what type of investments are possible and what not. It's not always the least expensive project that is the best project. So we need to look at what is best for the electricity system, for decarbonization, for climate change, for people, for the environment. And there should not be losers, but there should be common winners. And this is a completely different mindset.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you make an important point. Not necessarily the cheapest project is the best project. And we know this from public procurement as well. So not, let's say from...
Or ends up being the cheapest.
It's important to valorize the different aspects of the project. The same project can help the electricity system, but in the same time can do a different role for the environment, because we can detect fireworks or fire in the wood, or against problems with frane, I don't know, the movement of the soil, or earthquakes, or not only earthquakes, but slides, thank you, slides, or many other things, pollution, or birds that monitoring birds, and so on. You can use those electric lines for many aspects. So if you valorize the different use of the same infrastructure and permit us to spend more money, we can solve more problems.
Sorry, it's not about spending more money. It's about planning together. Because if you plan together, you can then address different needs. I would like to argue that a grid operator, we have two, they can use common sense, they can have great ideas, but probably they don't know all the stuff that ornithologists know, and they cannot interpret the needs and the wants of people on the ground. So planning together is what makes a difference.
It's basically moving away from the kind of, if you want, 20th century project planning, which we are still seeing quite a lot, and other sectors are way behind this sector. So the traditional way of planning is you get your engineers to decide what you want to do, then you get the political deal to be able to do it, and then you pay some consultancy to do you an impact assessment, which is basically about showing that it's all fine. And then you declare that it's all fine. Your political masters with whom you've pre-cooked the deal bless it, and off you go, and you bulldoze away through the land. And then you get the insurrection from the local communities and the local militants and so on, and then the knee-jerk reaction is to say, oh, that's all NIMBY, let's crack down on them and do it anyway. And then, you know, the rest of the story is different, depending on how strong you are, how strong they are. Moving from that to what we need if we are serious about the kind of Energiewende that we need, about the we need to build a hell of a lot of new infrastructures, we need to change existing infrastructures, we need a lot of things to change very fast in the coming decades. You cannot do it if you don't have society with you. And that means moving to that sort of space of co-planning where you put the problems on the table, you don't negate them, you don't poo-poo anyone that disagree with you by saying, oh, he's stupid, he's not an expert, he doesn't understand. And you try to say, okay, yes, we have a number of problems and a number of objectives and also a number of disagreements, and let's see how we can create a social consensus around it. It's more complicated, it's more messy, but at the end of the day, it's going to be quicker, it's going to be cheaper, and it's going to be the only way to do things, and it takes you away from the risk of kind of, frankly, societal collapse that we are starting to see ever more, where you get people that lose faith in institutions, all institutions, including at a certain point NGOs, because if the Commission is not seen to be able to be a credible guarantor of the rules, then why do we need the EU? And there's one country that has already gone that way. If we cannot believe companies because they are all really trying to make money and so on, then you start getting at a certain point the demands to come in and nationalize and take away and do it. So if NGOs are not able to, in our case, save nature, then we become at a certain point irrelevant. And then you are in a very, very, I think, uncomfortable space for anyone in this room. You are in a space where it really becomes impossible to do anything that is big and long term. And, we go back to the Middle Ages. Every village looks after his own interests, and, that's the exact opposite of the PCI.
Okay. Just another one point. We have an agreement with two very important NGOs, Italian NGOs, international NGOs, like WWF and Legambiente, and we collaborate in two different levels. In the strategic environmental assessment, when the need must be traduced in project, idea of the project, and we work together for the best macro localization and the best technology we can use. And the second level is before the environmental impact assessment, when we collaborate with the territories, consulting them and working together. In those two last steps of the process, we collaborate for create the best project and have transform the project in an opportunity for the territory, for the environment.
Just one quick point to Antonello. We agree to disagree today, and I like the approach that the whole system can be made as a win-win, but what we do see on the ground is that there are interests that are opposite, and sometimes when you have a creative mind, and we try to be creative, you get a win-win situation, but there are a lot of cases where somebody loses, and what we see right now is that environmental legislation in Germany is very strong for very good reason, and but that the public opinion and the planning of municipalities and other stuff sometimes falls back then on a legal basis, and they feel themselves as a loser, and then you lose them as stakeholders that would generally accept PCI projects, but then see themselves fighting not only against the project but also against environmental legislation. And it's very hard for us as a TSO to deal with that because we're standing in the middle of this fight.
That's clear, but that's what exactly I said. We need to overcome this. We need to think out of the box. We need to experiment with new ideas. We need to find new approaches, new solutions. In Germany, There is a kind of a gray legislation in place of paying compensation in the range of 40,000 euro per kilometer of line built. You give the money and you forget about it. Maybe that's an opportunity to use this money and maybe even other money that you can combine to create a revenue stream for the people. So it just, what I'm saying is that we need to be much more imaginative of what we can do, and we need to have the courage to experiment. And we may do 10 things wrong and 2 good, then we say, they didn't work, but these 2 work, and I'm going to scale them. This is what we have to try, because the divide between people and nature is becoming more and more strong, and we will see it much more with the impact of climate change, where we will see a deterioration of livelihood for many, many people. And so again, it's about survival in a very rough environment. Your life will get much more complicated. It's not going to get easier. And that's why we need to have more courage, more open mind, and more support from the regulatory framework.
Thank you very much for these very interesting comments. I also noted at an earlier intervention from Thomas his remarks about local authorities, municipalities, and things like this. I mean, in a complementary way, I would make another comment, which is not necessarily related to the environmental obligations or the energy legislation necessarily. We notice a trend across the European Union or across a lot of member states, which shows that the capacity of local administrations has been weakened, in particular after the economic crisis. Also, the capacity of environmental authorities has been weakened. This has ultimately a negative impact on the different permitting procedures and authorizations. The more competence is lost from the local authorities in particular, which are by definition small, with the exception of a few large cities across the member states, the more competence is lost, the harder it gets to get certain authorizations. So national legislators in general and national decision makers, politicians, need to reflect also on this. We are all in favor of streamlined and lean states and public authorities, but there are certain things which must be preserved and maybe developed, competencies that must be developed because they are in the public interest. Other things maybe can be further simplified. But I think we have a certain degree of consensus, or maybe a significant degree of consensus between the members of the panel, but maybe we can hear also from the room comments, remarks, questions, and I think we have a gentleman here in the third line. The microphone is circulating. Please do not hesitate. Please introduce yourselves first.
Mark Howard from Store Electric. You said quite early on an impassioned appeal. Please do not bring forward projects unless they are fully developed environmentally and such like. Now that would destroy the entire purpose of PCIs. The reason for that is because PCIs establish a need and an opportunity, and then you need 7 or 8 figures of money to look into where best to locate it, how best to structure it, how best to construct it, how to improve its environmental performance, and so on and so forth. And unless it's been put forward as a PCI already, it cannot have assistance to do that work, and therefore the number of projects will diminish enormously.
Yeah, it seems to me that we need to find a way to reconcile obligations which are defined even in the regulation creating the basis for this funding facility, and obligations which are enshrined in national and European legislation in the area of environment primarily, and this desire to, let's say, be disruptive and be, or maybe not disruptive, but you make the case for bringing projects at an early stage to see whether you can get funding and you can develop on them. Because the experience with certain projects that we have seen, brought sometimes even together by a couple of member states, we see that when they are immature, they will take a long number of, a long time in order to comply with the different obligations. And this is detrimental, ultimately also for the business plan of the developer of the project or the proponent of the project. But Antonella?
I have two things to say about that. First is that it would be very useful to have an SCA on the TYNDP, on the 10-year development plan, because if you had an SCA, strategic environmental assessment, you already know which are the areas that you have to consider as ideally a no-go, or you have a better base to start the negotiation for a PCI, whether you apply for PCI. Submitting, identifying an electricity need or a gas grid, there are not much left of a need there, but an electricity need means, doesn't mean that you select the corridor. The corridor is the next step where you are going to apply for funding in certain situations. The other thing I want to mention is that all the 10-year regulation has been extremely useful, but going ahead with this very fast changing environment in energy, we need to be vigilant and see whether we need to adapt it at a certain point in time. We have seen a lot of PCI projects in the list that have stayed on the list for years and years, nothing happened. And if you tell me today I need this because of A, B, C, D, and this project is not realized, well, maybe you didn't need it actually. If I have a project that is not realized in 10, 15, 20 years, me as a citizen, I find it very hard then to believe that we really need it. And they say, yeah, but there is a loss here, there is a loss there. But maybe we need to rethink what is that we really needed. I mean, that means looking at how do we satisfy needs in different ways, what are the options, how do we maximize and optimize what we already have, and how do we access technological innovation and all of the laws. So I'm just saying, it's getting more complicated, and we will need a regulation that adapts and reflects to this changing level of complications.
You've made an important point, Antonella. I'm not very familiar with the energy regulations and how the planning goes on in the sector of energy, but you've made this important point about the strategic environmental assessment, which was generally seen by a number of authorities, but also economic operators, not only in the area of energy, as a pain in the neck and as a very burdensome and bureaucratic thing. And we are trying to convey the message that the obligations for strategic environmental assessment and for environmental impact assessment for projects can go hand in hand. And you can free yourself of a lot of the burden and of the need in planning and decision making if you do a good strategic environmental assessment where you get clarity about different aspects, not only about the environmental aspects. So we have noticed also that a number of public authorities have tried to bypass the strategic environmental assessment. Unfortunately, the public brings this, not necessarily to the European Commission, brings this in national courts. And national courts address preliminary questions to the Court of Justice. And there have been developments, let's say, in the Court of Justice of the European Union over the past 3-4 years, a few landmark judgments, sometimes passed by the Grand Chamber of the courts of particular significance, which have sent, hard messages to a number of public authorities about the importance of the Strategic Environmental Assessment Directive and the obligations there. And there is, I mean, some member states appear as discovering again America, while it was there since years and years. So we need a process, and we should never stop working with our member states and with the public authorities, but also with the associations of economic operators in raising the awareness about how things which appear complex can be very well simplified, and if they are tackled properly in time, they provide a lot of business certainty, of legal certainty to the businesses. I think a gentleman here in the second line.
Hello, yeah. Yes, sorry, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I think this panel discussion is very positive. My name is Darren Quinn. I am a private project developer of a grid-scale pump storage plant in Ireland, in silver mines in Ireland. And I think my philosophy as an environmental planner and project promoter is actually to embrace the environment much more than them against us. I think the purpose of infrastructure and PCI is to benefit the citizens of Europe and member states. And that connection is probably what needs to be, I suppose, explained so the public and citizens can truly understand actually these infrastructure projects are for their benefit. Our own project is quite unique in that it's a pumped hydropower plant. It's looking to remediate a brownfield site, a 400-acre mining site that's been contaminated and left abandoned for the last 25 years. So there's a huge environmental gain or environmental opportunity. And we spent the last 5 or 6 years developing the project, but a huge part of that was the public engagement. And over 2.5 years ago, we presented the project to the public, to the local community. We explained the benefits, that there was an opportunity to do something really positive, that there was actually an environmental enhancement opportunity. And their support has been huge. And I would quite confidently say that we actually have an army of supporters within the local community and the local region who are actively promoting the project and would like to see it happen. So I think if, as opposed to them versus us, it's more of actually we're in this together, I think we could have a better opportunity, because at the end of the day, the objectives of PCI is to deliver climate action, and there's commercial opportunities within that, and it's to leverage those commercial opportunities. So I think this discussion is very positive, and it's for that to filter down into whatever regulations and the work the European Commission is doing.
I want just add some, if I have 1 minute more. I have 3 slides for an interesting approach for blue corridors. Yesterday, AGI members have signed an important agreement, a marine grid declaration, and about this, we spoke about sea, so let me tell you something. Submarine cables are very, very important for the decarbonization goals, and we need plans that are sustainable for marine habitats. And we have 4.5 billion of investment in marine cables in our development plan. And as you know, Italy is surrounded by the sea, and we have Posidonia oceanica. It's a very important habitat, very fragile, very important for a marine ecosystem. And for respect Posidonia oceanica, we lay cables on the Posidonia meadows. But we have a very important problem to protect our cables from anchoring and trolling. And why not? We have the opportunity to preserve and protect the cables and also, at the same time, Posidonia oceanica. Next slide, please. Okay. We are thinking about 3 projects. The first project is to develop localization criteria for marine environment. We applied successfully those criteria for on land, and we want to extend this approach for marine environment. We use a traffic light approach. Red light, we don't pass. Exclusion areas. Repulsion areas is like orange, in this case blue color. We pass with prescriptions, and attraction, green light, we pass preferably. And there is another class problem. It's an open box where we can put the new aspects, environmental aspects, and we decide where classify those aspects in repulsion or exclusion or attraction or neutral criteria. So we apply those criteria, and we describe the territory, represent the territory, and we apply those criteria. We create a surface cost, environmental surface cost, and where the cost is minimum is the best way to pass. And we create different alternative roads, and we can choose the best. It's a very transparent approach, and we build those criteria with local authorities, with NGOs, environmental NGOs, because the rules that we want to apply must be shared before. This is the first project. The second, next slide, please. Okay, as I told you before, we need to protect the cables and Posidonia at the same time. So we can apply protection techniques for cables and Posidonia. In this case, for cables, we can use matrices with eco-compatible meters, and with blocks, in this case, are full, but we want to produce blocks that with holes that permit the Posidonia to grow up in the middle, so that matrices cover the cable and at the same time permit the grow up of the Posidonia. And in the same time, we can also use trolling deterrent. We can use iron poles inflicting in the Posidonia meadows to preserve cables and Posidonia for against trolling. And the third project, next slide, please. Okay, here we can find a PCI project. It's a cable that link Sardinia, Corsica, and Italy. We call it Sacoi 3, Sacoi 3. It's a very important link. And there is another project here, a cable that links Elba Island with the continent, with Tuscany. Okay, as you know, we have to characterize and monitor the environment, marine environment. We want to extend this monitoring, and we want to use different BOAs, 2 BOAs, one on the surface of the sea and the other deep, to check with sensors that catch ultrasounds of mammals and pelagic species. And in this way, we can have more detail, more data, more information about those important species. And we can use this data for best manage the environment ecosystem. In this way, we can valorize our cables as a transect, in this case, for monitor the environment and collect more data for best manage the environment. As we told before, we want to valorize our projects not only for energy point of view, but from the environment at the same time. Thank you.
Dual-use projects, yes. Thanks a lot for this, and thanks a lot for to the gentleman from Ireland. I understand, yeah, somebody there wants to intervene, please.
Thank you. Yeah. Marieke Rijhout, European Hydrogen Association. As Terna and TenneT are in the panel, I would like to bring in another element in, indeed, environmental impact, and that is the link with energy infrastructure to transport. TenneT and GasUnie are working in Northern Netherlands. We are coordinating the market outlook for that project on linking the gas grids with electricity grids. And the purpose of this EU project that actually facilitated this first collaboration between a gas and electricity network, a good outcome of PCI efforts of the EU, I would say, is to connect to transport networks. We see increasing interest for hydrogen also in marine applications. First, ferries. A shipper in Belgium on front page 2 weeks ago in Belgian newspaper said, well, shouldn't we skip LNG if hydrogen is indeed approaching? Terna and Snamrete Gas recently signed an agreement. Complimenti. Credo che è un buon passo anche lì. What is indeed, in your view now, this perspective until 2030 in linking the energy networks to transport? Because it also has a big environmental aspect. And I haven't heard this kind of budding development that indeed has perspective until 2030 as well in EU programs. Thank you.
This agreement with, between Terna and SNAM, it's very, very important. We want to create a very strong collaboration in the strategic approach and valorize two different aspects that needs to go together. So we have different line of research together, and we are very proud, and we hope that this collaboration will give us a good opportunity to the decarbonization goals. So we wait the result.
Can I add something? So I think that's an important development. Of course, there is no certainty what the future will look like, but there is a certainty that we have to try a lot of different things. Today, we already see in countries like Germany, but not only, an increasing share of curtailment. If we can, instead of curtailing wind, especially wind, use it for electrolyzing and producing green hydrogen, this is a very good option. It is important to do pilot projects on this because we need to gain experience, and we need to then also gain economy of scale. Today the costs are still high, but in a world where we will have the majority of the electricity generated through renewables, of course, power to X, power to gas, is a very important piece.
Maybe one addition, I do agree that linking energy systems is a central task of the future. And we as TenneT and as a grid operator not only see it as its environmental impacts, we also have the need to deal with all the renewable energy that comes into our system, and therefore we see big opportunities in linking those energy sectors. On the other hand, one topic that you already mentioned when it comes to natural preservation on a local level, more help from the legislator and from the authorities would definitely help with that.
Thanks a Thanks a lot for these very interesting comments. I wonder whether there are other interventions from the room or critical remarks. The gentleman here in the third line.
Yes, I'm Pierre Jørgensen from Rambøll Consultancy Company. I have one comment, one question. It's the difference between PCI projects and other kinds of projects. I think a lot of discussion so far has been on projects in general, and not you can say the advantage of having a project as a PCI project when we talked about environment. We have some time frames in the PCI regulation about how to implement PCI projects in a, you can say, within a certain time frame. But very often it's not possible to use this time frame because most developers want to do things faster than the time frame actually provides these 3.5 years. So how do you see the main difference between PCI project and non-PCI project?
If you want to comment?
Yeah, I always want to comment. Always want to comment.
Yeah.
Well, it very much depends country by country, because in some regions a PCI label is worth something, and in other regions it's not. It depends on the local reality. When it comes to environmental protection, it's exactly the same. The implementation of the European directives varies greatly from region to region, and Ariel was pointing at that. What I can share with you is that the 10-year regulation has helped a lot of national authorities to become more effective in their approaches. So they have somehow tried to extend the 10-year regulation, if not all of it, but some elements to that, to all the projects. And I think this is what should happen, because from a stakeholder point of view, there is absolutely no difference who is building the project, if it is for Europe or not. So that's what we should really push for. The other thing that I would like to add, it's in the case of interconnectors towards third countries, but also within the European Union. You have differences in the application of the directives, and you can create delays, challenges, because on one side of the cable you have a set of rules with own timing, and on the other side of the cable you have different rules with different timing. And when it comes to third countries, I recommend that project developers, but also the Commission giving this PCI label, there is a commitment to apply the same level of environmental protection, stakeholder engagement on both sides of the cable. Because we cannot allow, as Europeans, we are so fond about our laws and our ideals, and say, okay, beyond this line, our ideals are no longer important. Actually, they are. And so this, we need to strive to have increasingly aligned approaches for all the projects that are reaching out to our neighboring borders, countries.
I mean, I'm no expert in the energy area, but from a certain distance, I've noticed that those projects for which neighboring member states have created a joint enterprise somehow can fare better, because that joint enterprise take care of compliance on both ends of the project in the two member states. We also need to take, however, into account the fact that the, environmental constraints, the physical constraints might be different. You may have point relevant, for instance, under the Water Framework Directive, on one side of the border, and it's less relevant or irrelevant completely on the other side of the border. So sometimes it's not always possible to have, how to say, perfect uniformity. But to echo the first remark that Antonella made, and to recall what I've said in one of my initial interventions, sharing entirely the concern for simplification and streamlining, we have tried in the revision of the EIA directive in 2014 to echo what the good advances that were made through the 10E regulation, the simplification and the streamlining. We had the surprise sometimes in the Council on certain proposals for introducing, for instance, deadlines for different procedural steps to see the member states in a majority being against. The directive obliges some simplifications, and for other aspects gives only the possibility of the member states. So it's for them to decide on this. I think we need to look, I'm not trying to, how to say, discharge myself or my institution and to shift the burden on the shoulders of the member states, but I think there is a responsibility of the national regulators for proceeding with this simplification and integration. And we need to stand together in front of these responsibilities and to handle them together, of course, in solidarity, but there are also, let's say, individual responsibilities, and national regulators are part of the game, and they must also apply simplification in practice. We have seen, we know by now what certain different member states, we have the complete picture in the European Union, and we have seen that some member states have embraced this opportunity and have went to the end of it, others not really. We will publish a report about this. We are currently evaluating the strategic environmental assessment directive, and by the end of the year we will publish a report about the practice in the member states. So that will be very instructive, and we hope very much that the legislator will reflect, looking at the comparative practices, how things fare in my country and why things fare better in another country, what they have done there. It's a constant challenge. We share your concerns, and we hope to be able to improve things. We need two to tango. Some tango, others still learn, but we remain optimistic. Are there other comments or questions? No one, so I don't know, I guess unless you have more remarks to make or suggestions. Yes, closing remarks, yes, you are very much keen for this, so please, by all means.
Then I would like to thank again for the invitation, and I would like to invite everybody to come to the exhibition. I'm there with plenty of colleagues, and we're happy to show some of our projects and best cases, what we've done in order to prevent environmental damage.
Only one word. I'm very happy about this new culture that RGI helped us to develop. A very strong collaboration between TSOs and NGOs. This is a very new culture, and we apply this new approach in Italy, in our country, and we are very proud to have a very useful collaboration with NGOs, and we are creating better projects respecting the environment and with citizens.
Yeah, just to add that I think two of the frontiers for us where we would like to see more of that kind of approach going is, and the overlap is offshore, because the marine environment has a lot of special difficulties about it, and we will see a lot of further development in marine environment. And the other is the wind sector, where, as we know, there are some very serious real problems of conflict between energy generation and biodiversity conservation. We know there are also solutions and way of doing things properly, but where the gap between the best performers and the worst performers is huge. So that's certainly two areas, and of course offshore wind is where the two things come together, where we would really like to see more of this kind of new spirit moving further and faster.
So maybe just to add on this offshore, all of you know that there are really massive plans for offshore expansion. These are hundreds of megawatts that have to be realized if we want to have a chance to meet our energy and climate targets. And most of this has to happen in the next decade. We are talking about 10, 15 years. The competition between people and in the marine environment, there are people, there are interests. Very often I heard, oh yeah, that's easier because it's at sea. No, our seas are so crowded. There are so many different users that competing interests are massive, even larger than on land. So nature and energy is a newcomer in the offshore environment. Of course, we always had pipelines and so on, but wind is definitely a newcomer, and electricity grids are also a rather newcomer. And for this, I would really see a process, and RGI is definitely going to work on that, of collaborative planning for the offshore, so that we can plan together with all the possible stakeholders where to build infrastructure, how to use the resources to protect nature, and to create new protection areas, ecosystems, but also to maintain the livelihood of fishermen. Do not bother the military, which is also there, shipping, and you name it. It's all there. Everyone is fishing in that pond.
Yeah, thank you very much. As a last comment, I would repeat that I think after experience of decades in this area, one can see the trends, and we can see successful experiences, and we can see also entities and authorities struggling. And there is no enigma here. There is no particular secret recipe for this, but there is a solution which is publicly available. Invest in compliance, invest in early planning and in awareness raising, and raise yourselves your awareness, and we see those authorities, those economic operators that invest in compliance and embrace compliance with environmental regulations, but also with other regulations and obligations, are quite successful and make it through very quickly, surprisingly quickly sometimes, and make it well. They do it well, and their projects also find support in their communities. In general, those that try to take a shortcut encounter a difficulty sooner or later in the stages. So it is worth investing in compliance, in early planning, and in the preparation of the projects. But more generally, I would like to thank my co-panelists or panelists for the opportunity to hear from them. And I must say it was a very interesting experience because most of you, with the exception of Aurel, I didn't know previously, and it was quite interesting and refreshing. Also to hear stories about positive experiences and solutions, and I'm grateful to the colleagues from DG Energy for offering me this possibility to be in this panel today and to have to hear also from other partner organizations in the area of energy. So thanks a lot, and I hope you will enjoy also the rest of the day, the coming debates.
Thank you.
Common interest boosts the use of energy from renewable sources. Every project selected by the EU ensures that it minimises the overall impact on wildlife and the environment. But that is not all. These projects build bridges between countries and distribute energy more efficiently. As a result, isolated and peripheral member states will be better integrated into the European energy market. Are you interested in these projects? Get involved now and play an active role. People working in industry can reduce their environmental impact by sharing good practices and cooperating closely with civil society. Let's work together and move towards secure, sustainable and affordable energy sources for all consumers. Join and help us modernize and better connect Europe's energy infrastructure. Projects are